There are thousands of federal buildings across the country that not only serve as workplaces for federal employees, they also host daily visitors who come to access important federal services and help keep our government functioning efficiently. These facilities face a range of security threats that put both people and property at risk, and those threats are only continuing to grow. Threats related to domestic and international terrorism and even disinformation are rising, and according to the Department of Homeland Security, can endanger our federal personnel and critical infrastructure. Today's hearing will focus on what actions are needed to secure the 9,000 federal facilities overseen by DHS Federal Protective Service. These facilities host the bulk of our civilian and federal employees and are visited by 1.4 million Americans each and every day. Currently, these federal facilities are secured through a two-step process. First, the Interagency Security Committee, led by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, establishes the security standards that federal facilities need to meet. The Federal Protective Service then uses those standards to see what safety measures can be improved. They identify risks to our federal facilities and then make recommendations as to how to mitigate them. FPS conducts thousands of these assessments each and every year. They submit these assessments to federal agencies, recommending countermeasures like security cameras, access control systems, and X-ray screening equipment. These tools make it easier to protect these facilities and the Americans who use them every day. Unfortunately, these recommendations are rarely implemented. From 2017 to 2021, FPS submitted over 25,000 of these reports. Federal agencies completely ignored roughly half of those. When agencies did acknowledge the recommendations, they only approved 27% of the recommended security measures. Factors like cost and bureaucratic hurdles often make it easier to maintain current systems. In other words, we're getting very useful information about how to improve security, but it's not being implemented to the extent that it should be. Today's hearing and our panel of witnesses will help us evaluate this problem. Our discussion today will also build on the executive order released on Monday by the White House, which clarifies the role of the Interagency Security Committee and helps us update interagency roles and responsibilities to keep these facilities safe. We will examine the landscape of current threats, the ways we can improve the assessment process, and how to make federal agencies more responsive when they receive recommendations. If we improve this process, we can make our federal facilities safer and more secure, and I look forward to this conversation. It is the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if each of you would please rise and raise your right hands. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Our first witness is Chris Klein, is the Director of the Federal Protective Service at the Department of Homeland Security. In this role, he oversees the safety and security of more than 9,000 federal facilities. Before joining DHS, he served for 20 years in the U.S. Army Military Police Corps Regiment. Welcome, Director Klein. You are recognized for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, distinguished members of the committee. As Director of the Federal Protective Service, I'm honored to be here today to represent the outstanding men and women of our agency and discuss the mission of FPS and the state of federal facility security. FPS is a law enforcement component within DHS with nearly 1,230 federal employees and approximately 17,000 contracted protective security officers in our workforce. Of that number, nearly 850 are highly trained and dedicated law enforcement professionals who have the enormous responsibility of protecting the federal government's physical infrastructure, which includes employees, contractors, and members of the public seeking government services, from incidents ranging from terrorist attacks to prohibiting dangerous items from entering federal facilities. Additionally, we protect 264 congressional field offices, including 16 field offices of 8 members of this committee. Now more than ever, our mission is critical to ensuring the safety and security of the federal government. Over the past few years, we have seen an increase in crimes at federal facilities and, more importantly, threats to federal civil servants. For example, earlier this year, there was an incident at a federal facility where the motive was to harm federal employees. Our officers initially responded to a report of a suspicious vehicle parked in front of the building. Those officers immediately locked down the facility, sheltered the employees in place, and coordinated closely with local law enforcement. The occupant of the vehicle fired a gun at responding officers and thankfully was taken into custody without injury to anyone. This is but one example of the important work FPS does in close coordination with our state and local law enforcement partners to support our law enforcement mission as well as criminal intelligence sharing. With more federal employees returning to brick-and-mortar offices, we have likewise increased our presence in and around those facilities. These enforcement and deterrence actions are in addition to our mitigation efforts highlighted by conducting facility security assessments, including countermeasure recommendations, implementation of state-of-the-art alert systems, screening equipment, and armed protective security officers. Our contracted protective security officers augment our law enforcement officers by standing post at thousands of facilities across the nation every day. They conduct a variety of security functions, including visitor screening operations, perimeter security roving patrols, and control center operations. Just this calendar year, we have prevented more than 15,000 dangerous weapons, including more than 500 firearms, from entering federal facilities. I also want to highlight that over the past year, we have delivered modernized and improved de-escalation and anti-bias training to our law enforcement officers, together with a modern approach to public order policing that focuses on individual bad actors to better protect First Amendment rights and the ability of citizens to peacefully protest. Whatever threats our country may face, I want to assure this committee that FPS continues to stand ready to protect our homeland. I was appointed to my role as director almost 1 year ago. Since then, I've visited FPS offices across the country, spoken with hundreds of our employees, and witnessed firsthand the commitment they have to our mission. My number one priority is to hire and retain a highly skilled and diverse workforce. Like most law enforcement agencies across the country, however, we are experiencing staff challenges, with approximately 1 out of every 4 positions currently unfilled. To address these challenges, we have dramatically increased our retention, recruitment, and hiring efforts, focusing on hiring candidates who bring valuable insight and experience into our organization. To retain our officers, I'm exploring all avenues and will continue to be relentless in my pursuit of equity for our officers. This includes a recently announced retention incentive that begins this next pay period for our uniformed officers. In closing, I would like to note that the President signed on Monday a new executive order that strengthens the work and role of the Interagency Security Committee. We believe the new executive order will enhance departments and agencies' acceptance and implementation of security assessment countermeasures. Additionally, the new executive order names the director of FPS as a primary member of the ISC, giving us a permanent role in using our expertise to shape risk-based, resource-informed decisions about government security. I would like to thank this committee for expressing interest in FPS's role in federal facility security and allowing me the opportunity to represent FPS workforce and testify on the critical role we play in our nation's overall security. I look forward to any questions you may have, sir.
Well, thank you. Our next witness is Dave Maroney, and he is the acting director of the Government Accountability's Office Physical Infrastructure Team. He oversees work on the Federal Real Property Management and the U.S. Postal Service. He has previously served on GAO's Natural Resources and Environmental Team, and before joining the GAO in 2004, he worked on the House Appropriations Committee. Mr. Maroney, great to have you here. You are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's work on agency efforts to secure federal facilities. 20 years ago, we placed managing federal real property on our high-risk list, in part due to threats to federal facilities. Recent incidents demonstrate that the security of federal buildings remains a high-risk area. Given that, it is critical that agencies implement appropriate countermeasures to address facility vulnerabilities, and that there's effective oversight of those efforts. The ISC and FPS play key roles in ensuring federal facilities have such countermeasures in place. In particular, the ISC establishes security standards and oversees agency compliance with those standards. FPS, for its part, uses the ISC standards to conduct security assessments at FPS-protected facilities and recommends countermeasures to help tenant agencies address vulnerabilities. Tenant agencies are then responsible for deciding whether to approve of those recommendations or accept the risk of not doing so. This past May, we completed a review of this process. What we found was that agencies only approved about 30% of FPS's recommendations over the past 7 years and implemented even less. Agency officials cited a number of reasons for the lower implementation rate, including cost and budget considerations, as well as the feasibility of implementing certain recommendations. We also found that agencies didn't respond to more than half of FPS's recommendations, even though they are required to do so by ISC standards. Officials cited a number of reasons for this high non-response rate, including not having enough time to consider recommendations and reticence to formally accepting the risk of not accepting them. At the time of our report, the ISC had taken steps to assess agency and facility compliance with its policies and standards. Specifically, in 2019, the ISC began using an annual questionnaire that asks agencies to self-report on whether they and their individual facilities comply with the standards. The ISC had also begun a process for verifying agencies' self-reported compliance by selecting a subset of agencies and facilities to review. However, the ISC was not assessing whether agencies were implementing recommended countermeasures at their facilities or documenting their decisions to accept the risk of not doing so. We reported that without this information on the implementation status of more than half of FPS's recommended countermeasures, the federal government might not have reasonable assurance that its facilities are secure. As a result, we recommended that the ISC improve its oversight of security measures by 1, assessing the implementation of FPS's recommended countermeasures, and 2, identifying unimplemented recommendations where agencies didn't document their acceptance of risk. To its credit, the ISC agreed with our recommendations and has taken steps to implement them. Specifically, the ISC plans to update its annual questionnaire to improve its oversight of agencies' implementation of FPS recommended countermeasures. In addition, it plans to verify that selected agencies documented their acceptance of risk for countermeasures they did not implement. These are positive steps. Completing these efforts may provide ISC a greater level of assurance that federal facilities are meeting security standards. It may also provide Congress with useful information on the extent to which federal facilities have addressed security vulnerabilities. In conclusion, the security of federal facilities remains a high-risk area. Having appropriate countermeasures in place is the first line of defense. The ISC is taking important steps to strengthen its oversight of agency actions on such countermeasures. However, sustained attention from the ISC, FPS, tenant agencies, and Congress will be needed to best ensure the security of federal facilities going forward. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my opening statement, and I'll be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Well, thank you. Our final witness is Scott Breor, who is the Associate Director of Security Programs with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS. In this role, he helps lead CISA's efforts to secure our nation's critical infrastructure and mitigate threats to large-scale public events. He has over 30 years of military and government experience, including as a former naval aviator and as a senior policy advisor for the Chief of Naval Operations. Mr. Breor, welcome. You are now recognized for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and members of the committee. As the Associate Director for Security Programs within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's Infrastructure Security Division, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to share the Interagency Security Committee's role in the security protection of federal facilities and its efforts to improve preparedness and mitigate risk in collaboration with interagency partners. On October 19, 1995, 6 months after the Oklahoma City bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, President Clinton issued Executive Order 12977, creating the Interagency Security Committee, or ISC, to address the quality and effectiveness of security for federal facilities. Membership of the ISC consists of senior-level executives from 67 federal departments and agencies. This collective security subject matter expertise allows the ISC to develop top-tier risk management resources and to coordinate interagency solutions to problems that cannot be solved by individual departments and agencies alone. The ISC is a collaborative forum that carries out its work by, with, and through its members within a primary governance framework of subcommittees and working groups. These working groups, which are provisional, are task-based bodies established by the ISC with clear objectives and defined deliverables. In March 2003, the role of chair transferred from General Services Administration to the Department of Homeland Security. DHS delegated this responsibility to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, considering its role in helping to protect and secure the nation's critical infrastructure. As you are aware, on Monday, November 27th, President Biden signed a new executive order titled Interagency Security Committee. This new executive order supersedes Executive Order 12977 and reinforces the importance of the security of federal facilities in the face of both persistent and emergent threats. The new executive order outlines the following: defines duties and responsibilities to better balance the ISC's role with the central responsibility that departments and agencies have for federal facility security. Specifies the requirement for departments and agencies to designate a senior official responsible for implementation and compliance with the executive order and to support facility security committees. Increases visibility and accountability by adding the requirement for the ISC to submit a biennial report detailing compliance results to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget and to the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. The ISC will continue to fulfill its responsibilities through multiple lines of effort, including the Risk Management Process Standard. This standard provides an integrated single source of security countermeasures and guidance on countermeasure customization for all non-military federal facilities. ISC members created the Risk Management Process Standard to provide a common method for all federal facility security stakeholders to guide risk assessments in a standardized way and to help facility owners identify levels of protection needed to mitigate their risk. Further, the ISC validates member risk assessment tools and training programs as meeting the Risk Management Process Standard. This helps build individual and organizational capability to successfully implement ISC guidance. In conducting these assessments, FPS uses a risk assessment tool validated by the ISC, the Modified Infrastructure Survey tool. Additionally, the ISC also validated FPS's physical security training program located at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. This training program trains FPS personnel on how to conduct a risk assessment using their Modified Infrastructure Survey tool. Two of the main drivers of threats to federal facilities are targeted violence and terrorism. These threats are becoming more varied and complex. Combating them is and will remain a top priority for DHS. DHS is committed to using every resource available to prevent, detect, and mitigate threats of violence directed at federal facilities. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today and for this committee's continued support of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the department. As a member and representative of the ISC, I look forward to continuing to work closely with you and other members of the Senate to keep our federal facilities and those who work at and visit them safe and secure.
Well, thank you. Director Klein, in May of 2023, DHS released a National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin which warned of emerging threats regarding the 2024 election and domestic extremist violence. How would the implementation of the FBS security recommendations actually help address and hopefully prevent these threats? If you could be more specific for the committee, that would be wonderful.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters. The security countermeasures that we recommend are based on the ISC standards, obviously, with the goal of obtaining the necessary level of protection to ensure that the employees are safe in their workplace. We also conduct a threat assessment of that facility to determine the local threats, national threats, international threats, and any threats that may be associated with a specific agency that's located within that facility. And we also work with the agencies on plans to enhance that protection at that facility based on the NTAS levels. All this is used to determine the countermeasures necessary to ensure protection of the employees and the facility So the goal of reaching that necessary level of protection, which is basically the minimum security standards to protect the facility, is necessary whether it's day-to-day operations or during an in-test elevation.
Director Klein, next question is, in your written testimony, you mentioned the, quote, significant role that the Federal Protective Service plays in countering threats posed by unmanned aircraft systems. However, FPS authority to counter these unmanned aircraft systems is actually going to expire this coming February. Would you please explain why it's so important that we extend this authority and what you believe the consequences could be if we do not extend this critical authority?
Thank you very much, sir, and we really appreciate the work of the committee members, yourself included, for pursuing the extension of that counter-UAS authority. It's critical for us to ensure the protection of federal facilities. Today, we have a counter-UAS mitigation operation in place at the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security. We also have a mobile system we use that we deploy to federal facilities during high-risk events, like high-risk trials that may be going on around the country. We work with the FAA to implement the temporary flight restriction and then set up the counter-UAS program at that facility. For us, without that ability, we have detected about 900 drones in and around federal facilities since 2019. That's a good number. Most of those are not targeted at federal facilities. The ones that we have mitigated at St. E's, normally it's on Christmas afternoon when someone got a new drone for Christmas and they don't realize that they're flying into a temporary restricted airspace. But this is an emerging threat across the country. We see what's going on in other parts of the world with drones, and we think it's critical that authority be continued and extended to the agencies that are mentioned in the draft legislation, but also to continue our operation at the critical federal facilities that we protect.
Thank you, Mr. Maroney. In your May 2023 report, GAO found that almost 70% of the countermeasures recommended by the Federal Protective Service to help secure buildings were not implemented by agencies. So I think this committee needs to hear, what are the primary reasons why agencies, in your estimation, are rejecting, ignoring, or failing to implement these recommended countermeasures?
A number of reasons. On the side of not approving recommendations, cost considerations were cited by many officials, budgetary considerations. So many of these facilities are multi-tenant agency facilities, so each of those agencies needs to provide funding to implement some of these countermeasures that can add some level of difficulty. Sometimes there's feasibility concerns. The recommendations are based on the ISC standards, but some facilities, based on their age or other space limitations, it may not be possible to implement there. On the other side, and even more concerning, the 55% of recommendations where there was no response from the committees. And the reasons cited there range from the time frame. Agencies have 45 days from receiving the recommendations to make a decision. Some agencies said that was too tight of a time frame for more complex countermeasures. Also, reluctance sometimes to accept risk of not implementing recommendations they choose not to implement. They don't want to formally note that. And then at times, communication issues among the committees. This is a collateral duty for the officials on these committees, and sometimes they do not have as much expertise, and so responding to the recommendations can not be as high of a priority as it should be.
Well, clearly it is a priority, so we're going to have to work to make that so. So I've got a question for both you, Mr. Maroney, and to you, Mr. Klein, is that I have been working on legislation that would require agencies to respond to the Federal Protective Service security recommendations within 90 days. So I want both of your opinion. Would such a requirement improve responsiveness and building security in your estimation? We'll start with you, Mr. Maroney first, and then Mr. Klein.
Yes, that's in line with our recommendations from earlier this year of the importance of increased oversight on these recommendations, particularly the ones where they're not responded to. The ISC standards allow for agencies to accept risk and not implement recommendations, but they at least should be responding and formally accepting risk if they're not going to do so. So, yes.
That's a very strong yes. Mr. Klein?
Yes, sir, and I'd agree with a very strong yes. The ISC requirement is the 45 days. We have heard from agencies, I need more time, this is very complex, I got to coordinate with the other agencies located in a multi-tenant facility. 90-day requirement coming through legislation would definitely strengthen the agency's need to reply to those recommendations.
Great. Well, thank you. Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thanks, Senator Peters. I want to thank you for having this hearing, and I really want to thank the witnesses not only for being here today, but for the work that you do and for the teams that you lead. So I hope you will send our thanks back to your teams as well. And I really have kind of a series of follow-up questions because my questions are quite similar to Senator Peters. As he mentioned, recently, FBI Director Wray told this committee that domestic violent extremism remains the most persistent terrorist threat to Homeland Security. Specifically, Director Wray highlighted the risk presented by small groups or lone actors who commit violent acts after becoming radicalized due to inflammatory and often false information shared on the internet. So, Director Klein, can you drill down a bit more on the risks posed to government facilities by domestic violent extremists, how federal inspectors evaluate these risks when they're conducting facility security reviews, and maybe especially when they're conducting these reviews on facilities that house multiple government agencies that may have different risk levels? So how are you guys all handling that?
Thank you, Senator Hassan. It's a great question, and it is an issue that we think about every day. With not only the domestic violent extremism, but also the lone actors. A number of the agencies that we protect provide services to citizens of the United States. And there are times when those services may be, when someone applies for a benefit, it may be reduced or denied. And people become upset about that. That's the majority of the threats we receive, either telephonically, emailed, some are in person, and some are mailed through the snail mail. So we are focused on this every day. Now, as far as the security countermeasure recommendations, you know, it's all based on the facility security level. It's a level 1 through 5. The 5s are the highest risk facilities, the 1s are the lowest. And then the countermeasures that we're recommending, based on ISC standards, based on the risk management process, are to get them to that necessary level of protection. Whether it's from a DVE, from a lone actor, whatever it may be, it's to protect those people that are inside that facility.
But when you have agencies that might, if they were in separate facilities, have different risk levels, how are they being asked to share that risk? You know, you're protecting for the highest risk entity, right?
Right. Yes, ma'am. So that is a good question that we hear a lot from the agencies. So a multi-tenant facility might be 5 to 10 different agencies in a facility, sometimes 20. And some of those agencies may be more public-facing, more threatened than other agencies in the building. And the tenants of the agency will tell our folks and the Facility Security Committee, like, it's their fault. You know, that's why we're level 4, is because they're here. Maybe if they would move. But that's not the process we use. We're looking at everyone in the building. What's the iconic value of the building, of the agencies that are in the building? What kind of work do they do? And then that's how we determine the facility security level in coordination with the FSC, but also the countermeasure recommendations that are put in place.
Well, I appreciate that. I also wanted to follow up with you, Director Klein, on the issue of reauthorizing DHS's authority to counter threats posed by drones or unmanned aerial systems. It expires in February. I agree that we need to extend that authority, but as threats from drones continue to grow, I want to know whether your current authorities, assuming we can extend them after February, are sufficient to protect DHS facilities and personnel, or whether you think you need any additional authorities to address emerging threats.
Thank you, ma'am. It's a great question, a great issue that we're working with. So the Preventing Emerging Threats Acts of 2018, the authority that were provided in there, along with the other DHS and DOJ components, is adequate for us to do our job. It allows the Secretary to make decisions to what assets he'll cover, what facilities will be covered. We have a number of other facilities we are planning to cover in the future. Right now, it's St. Elizabeth's, the DHS headquarters, 24 hours a day. And then that mobile system I mentioned that we have the ability to move to other places based on the threat levels. But what we have currently in the legislation is adequate for FPS. I can't speak on CBP,
Right.
Coast Guard, or the Secret Service.
Sure, okay, I appreciate that. So, Mr. Brior and Director Klein, this question goes to both of you, and it's really based on something that Mr. Maroney has testified to. Federal agencies, as we've talked about, failed to implement most of the 32,000 security recommendations made by the FPS from 2017 to 2023. Agencies failed to even respond to more than half of the recommendations, and according to GAO, they implemented fewer than 1,800 of the recommendations made during the period. Is there any record of who specifically at any agency or on a facility security committee determines which recommendations will be implemented? And the kind of follow-up to that is, who's responsible for the decision that a facility will accept a certain level of risk and not implement a recommendation? So, Mr. Brior, we'll start with you.
Well, begin with at the facility level. If it's a multi-tenant facility, then it's the Facility Security Committee. And the chair of that typically is the one that has the most square footage with respect to that facility. At the agency level, this is where we totally embrace the new executive order that came out on Monday, because it designates a senior official for that agency to ensure the implementation of the executive order. And that is a piece in the governance structure that we have not had and we have needed. Okay. So with that, and the fact that that senior official is also going to be responsible and accountable for the federal security committees at the local level, is going to be the governance structure that we need to move this forward.
Thank you. Director Klein, anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, ma'am. We use an assessment tool. It's a computer-based assessment tool that our inspectors use when they go out to do their facility security assessments. And the time frame ranges anywhere from a couple of days for a small facility to a month for a large facility. But those measures that they're using in that tool are based on the physical security criteria for federal facilities. That database that we have has all of our federal facilities. It has the agencies there, the square footage, the cost of the countermeasure implementation. So we have that information, the details of what information is available. We could work with your staff to determine what you need, and we can get it to you.
I think what we're trying to get at in a constructive way is who makes these determinations? What does it mean to be the person at an agency who, quote, accepts the risk because they're not implementing certain recommendations? And I think we want to drill down on that a little bit. I am out of time, so I will follow up with you in writing about that. But thank you all again for your work.
Thank you, Senator Essen. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here. Director Brior, if I could just start with you. How familiar are you with the case Missouri versus Biden?
Not really familiar.
Well, I've got it.
I understand the outline, but
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm aware of it, but I don't know in depth.
You say you're aware of it. What are you aware of?
I'm aware of the context around misinformation, disinformation online.
So Missouri versus Biden is the United States District Court and then the United States Court of Appeals that ruled in both cases that the United States government violated the First Amendment by coercing and censoring speech and using the biggest corporations in the world to do it. And I'm asking you about it because a large portion of the case concerns CISA. So let me just read some of the relevant portions since you say you're not too familiar with it. This is from the court's opinion. CISA, working in close connection with the FBI, held regular industry meetings with the platforms, that's the social media platforms, concerning their moderation policies, pushing them to adopt CISA's proposed practices for addressing misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. CISA also engaged in switchboarding operations, meaning that CISA officials acted as intermediaries for third parties by forwarding flagged content from them to the platforms. Like the CDC did for COVID-related claims, CISA told the platforms whether certain election-related claims were true or false. The court goes on, CISA violated the First Amendment. CISA was the primary facilitator of the FBI's interaction with the social media platforms and worked in close coordination with the FBI to push the platforms to change their policies. CISA also used its frequent interactions with social media platforms to push them to adopt more restrictive policies, and CISA affirmatively told them repeatedly what content was true or false and what needed to be taken down. So what the court found is, and there are voluminous findings here, both in the opinion and in the record, is that the government, acting through a series of agencies, including the one that you are a part of, used its power to go after protected First Amendment speech in a way that directly violates the First Amendment. Now, you have a long record of government service. I can't imagine that this is what you signed up to do. Let me just ask you first, you weren't in any way involved in any of the activities described by the court in these cases, were you?
I work physical security for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So I come in each and every day, and I'm focused on public gathering events, federal facilities security, and the sectors to ensure that they have physical security measures in place.
Okay, good. So
my focus, that is my expertise.
You weren't meeting with executives or counterparts at any of these social media companies as described by the court. Good. Now, let me just ask you, I mean, do you think that this is consistent with CISA's mission, the use of coercive power to try and censor American speech in a way that violates the First Amendment of the United States Constitution?
That's not the way the agency that I work for operates.
Well, are you saying it's not how it should operate? Because two courts have found it is how it's operating. I mean, that's the problem. Would you agree with me that that's a problem when federal courts find that the First Amendment has been violated by a federal agency using federal power to censor American speech? I mean, would you agree that's a problem?
I don't have the expertise or knowledge to comment on that.
But would you agree it's a problem when the First Amendment's violated? How about that?
Yes.
And would you agree it's a problem when the federal government violates the First Amendment?
Yes.
Okay. And when you say that it's not what the agency is doing, I mean, you would say that this is not, this sort of activity, the violation of the First Amendment, is not what CISA ought to be doing. Is that fair to say?
I'm saying I don't have knowledge of that.
Well, here's, I guess, my point to you, Director Brior. I appreciate the work that you do and your long service, record of service to this country. I just think it's important that this body sends the message to every agency that was involved in this. It is a serious thing to violate the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. It is a very serious thing. There is nothing more foundational to our democracy than the freedom of speech. And what these courts found is the federal government systematically, not accidentally, not oops, we went too far, systematically, over a period of months and years, set out to violate the First Amendment speech of ordinary Americans, including those in my home state of Missouri. And this is all on the record. In fact, my state brought the suit. So that's a pretty big deal. And I'm pretty upset about it. You're not the first person I've asked about it, and I promise you, you won't be the last. But I just want to send the message, and maybe you can take this message back to your agency, that this is not acceptable behavior, not by a long shot. If the federal government can tell people and can use the most powerful corporations in the world, to shut down speech it doesn't like on a variety of topics, elections, COVID, school boards, the Hunter Biden laptop story, I mean, pick it. There is so much censorship that these courts have found. We've got a serious problem that goes right to the heart of our democracy, and that's a serious issue for me. Director Klein, let me ask you a question here in just my remaining few seconds. You noted in your written testimony that FPS protects federal facilities at the U.S.-Mexico border. Have I got that right?
Yes, sir.
So let me just ask you, given the unprecedented surge in illegal immigration that we're seeing, let me ask you two things here, time permitting. The first one is, we've had multiple DHS whistleblowers who are special investigators within DHS come forward to my office and I think others and allege that they were pulled off of their assignments investigating child abuse, child trafficking, fentanyl. They were pulled off of that and sent to the southern border in order to perform, in their words, menial tasks. I just want to know, have any FPS officers, to your knowledge, been reassigned to the southern border to help with migrant processing?
Yes, sir. We do have a number of FPS officers that are supporting CBP at the southern border in 2 locations, and that's going on today.
When you say assisting with processing?
Not processing, let me explain what they're doing. So the Border Patrol, the goal is for us to support the Border Patrol so they can go back to do the work of the border. So our officers are transporting people to hospital appointments, to medical visits, to emergency rooms that may need for treatment. So the Border Patrol doesn't have to do that. They can focus on the border, and we're supporting them and escorting people to these appointments.
If I could just ask, where are these folks coming from who are transporting your agents? Where are they being taken from if they're now running people back and forth to the hospital on appointments and so forth?
Various locations throughout the country.
For example?
Boston, Chicago.
What would they otherwise be doing in those locations?
Federal facility protection.
So they're being pulled off of federal facility protection in order to go to the border and to take migrants to appointments?
Well, our goal is to support the Border Patrol. They have supported us in a number of occasions. When they call and ask for help, can you provide, and it's a very small number of officers that we're providing to them, can you provide help or a need for help? And we're going to help them because they've helped us in the past.
Well, I think that's important testimony, Director Klein. I'm grateful that you've given it, and sadly, it tracks exactly with what whistleblowers at DHS have told us that they're being asked to do. They're being taken off of their assignments, and they're being asked to do exactly what you just described, which is to run people back and forth, and one agent said that he was being asked to make sandwiches for illegal migrants. I mean, I have to say, I think it's kind of a problem when people aren't investigating child exploitation so that they can make sandwiches. And frankly, when your agents, who provide absolutely vital security services, are being used to run people back and forth to appointments. I mean, that's outrageous. That's absolutely outrageous. Obviously, it's not your fault, but I'm sorry that you're in that position. And I just register again, I mean, our border's in a state of crisis, and I think this is unbelievable. Thank you for your testimony. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I realize I'm over time.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Mr. Brewer, in your oversight of agency compliance with security standards, you rely on agencies to fill out questionnaires. However, your current questionnaires do not ask for information on the risk that agencies take if they fail to respond or choose not to follow Federal Protective Service recommendations. Why does ISC not account for these risks?
Thank you, sir. Currently, in the benchmark questionnaires that we have, at the agency level, we qualify that as risk acceptance versus describing it as implementation of a countermeasure. At the facility level, we actually do have that question. But what we've been seeing in the compliance feedback that we've been getting, we've been doing compliance now for 2 years, is that at the agency level, only about 50% of them actually have the plans, policies, and protocols in place that then cascade down to the facility level. So therefore, I think the tenants at the local level are just having that difficulty doing what is required with respect to the ISC due to lack of understanding and lack of training. Because of that, over the last year, we've doubled down on training Federal Security Committee members. We have virtual online training. We have in-person training, and also virtual instructor-led training to try to get the FSC members trained up to par. But I think more importantly, once we get the senior official designated for the agencies, we'll be able to increase the compliance aspects. And not only the documentation of unimplemented countermeasures, but also ensuring that the plans, policy, and protocols are in place in each of the agencies and departments.
Well, given you're not getting this information, that seems problematic. I guess my follow-up question to you, do you think you have enough data to actually understand the risk that agencies are facing right now, or do you need more data to really do the type of assessment necessary to secure these facilities?
That's exactly why we totally embrace the GAO recommendations and are moving forward with changing the questionnaire and the benchmarks in 2024 during the compliance run.
So you don't have the data you need right now?
not the full understanding of what exact countermeasures are being implemented, whether it's being documented, and whether that is supported by the department and agency at that level.
So clearly a major problem.
Yes, sir.
That was yes.
Yes.
Right. Director Klein, given the heightened threat environment and the need to ensure security of federal buildings and workers and the public that shows up at those facilities every day, does the Federal Protective Service, in your estimation, have enough uniformed officers to actually secure this portfolio?
Thank you, sir. That's a great question. So we are short-staffed right now, but we're still getting our mission done. We're using overtime dollars right now because we have officers staying later to protect our facilities, and it remains a challenge for us. We're observing some impact on our employee morale. I'm focused on ensuring that we don't have a burnout factor within our law enforcement workforce. And I've mentioned previously my #1 priority is to fill those vacancies. I did travel down to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center earlier this year, met with the director and asked for additional seats or classes for the basic police academy at Bletzy. We now have 8 classes through this year. By the end of this year, we should fill at least 75% of our vacant law enforcement positions. And then I don't want to tell you that I need more people right now because I need to fill the vacant positions I have and then evaluate how we're doing with with filling all the vacancies, having all our fully staffed on board, and then make decisions on do we need more. Now that we know we've got everyone on board, we can evaluate and determine if we need more people.
So the vacancies that are there, you said you're increasing your training academies. Are you having difficulty recruiting folks to the service, or is there a long line of folks wanting to raise their hand and serve?
We've had a little bit of both, Mr. Chairman. So we are competing for the same person that every other law enforcement agency is competing, city, county, state, and federal. We're all competing for that young, vibrant person to become part of our agency. Right now, it is a challenge to fill the seats. We are working kind of backwards, so we're filling the first classes first, and then we're working towards the other classes. We're reaching out to our candidates who have applied for our positions to check on, are you available to go to school on this date or this date or this date? A number of folks that we've recruited want to go to specific locations. And we may be filled, or we may not have vacancies in those locations, so we're offering them locations nearby. But they may want to go to one point because that's where they're from, that's where their family is. Whatever the reason is, they're stuck on, that's where I want to go. So we're going down that list of our people that we have in the pipeline, calling them, asking them about the due location. Here's what we have available nearby. Do you want that? And it's an all-out effort within all of our managers at FPS to fill these classes and to hire these people. I did mention the retention incentive earlier, sir, during my oral statement. You know, we have officers that are leaving to go to other agencies and they may have a better benefit than we do, or they're retiring or resigning for one reason or another. I worked with my boss and asked for the ability to provide a retention incentive to keep who we have on board, to keep them here until we can get these other new employees through all their training requirements and on board. We have a lot coming up in the next 14 months. Affecting federal facility security, including some trials that are coming up, the RNC and DNC, the election, and then ultimately the inauguration, that we need to make sure we have plenty of people available to respond and secure these facilities. That's why we went with this retention incentive. It does take effect next pay period for our current officers and agents. It's for our GS-12s and below, the people that we are trying to retain. And we think that's going to help us keep what we have on board while we fill the other classes and hire those other people.
That retention's for everybody.
Retention is for all of our law enforcement officers, GS-12 and below.
Yeah.
Not for me.
Right. So yeah. So the question is the folks who are coming out new, because all the challenges that you mentioned, highly competitive environment for law enforcement, a lot of offers are out there for folks. What is your retention rate for the newly graduated, the newly incoming folks? How many are there a year after training?
A year after training, 80%.
2 years.
We do lose some during the training. You know, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center has very high standards on test scores and fitness scores. and we do lose some people during that part of the
How much do you lose through training?
5%.
And
It's
then-
not a huge number.
Yeah.
But then, so we're looking at age groups. Over the last 5 years, we've been really focused on hiring veterans, using that veterans hiring authority to quickly bring them on board, deserving of an opportunity to join the federal government, especially when they've served overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan. And we've been really hiring a lot of those folks, but they're around 40 years old. They're a little older than the people that we're looking to recruit now, because we need a new focus on those young and vibrant, recent college graduates that have a different perspective on how to do things than old people like me. So we're focused on hiring those new folks now. Our retention rate is 14%. We lose about 14% of our LEOs every year. But we think that by offering this retention incentive for a couple of years while we fill these classes will allow us to keep them on board. And some do go to other agencies that have a better benefit than they have within FPS.
So given your challenges to be fully staffed, in the event that FPS officers can't respond to a developing incident, or there's simply not enough officers available, how do you cooperate with state and local law enforcement to make sure that you're adequately responding? If you could kind of walk us through as to your backup plan when bad things happen, you need people, where do you get them?
Absolutely, sir. We have great relationships with our city, county, and state and federal law enforcement partners throughout the country. Obviously, we don't have FPS officers in every city across the nation. We primarily staff our officers in those major metropolitan areas where there's a large federal community in that area. So there's many instances every day where a local law enforcement officer will respond to an incident at a federal facility because there's no FPS officer nearby. The FPS officer will respond, but he may be there in an hour, he may be there in 15 minutes, depending on how far he's commuting to that specific location. So city, county, state, and federal law enforcement agents and officers are closely tied to our mission. Our authority is the federal facility and the people in the facility. That sidewalk, that street, that city belongs to another law enforcement agency, and we have great partnerships with them to ensure our facilities are protected. And that happens every day, that coordination effort. We do work with our local law enforcement agencies to retain some level of authority to issue citations based on the city law enforcement. As an example, there's no federal crime for parking in a handicap zone, but we have handicap parking spaces in every facility across the country. So we leverage the local jurisdiction's violation notice to cite someone for a local crime instead of where there may not be a federal crime. And the local jurisdictions provide us that authority.
Very good. Mr. Maroney, federal real property management has been on the GAO's high-risk list now, I think, for over 20 years. Could you explain why it remains on that list, and what do we need to be focusing on? We got to get it off that list.
It's been on that list for 20 years because, one, there continue to be incidents which make it a high-risk area, but two, based on our ongoing work, we've continued to identify areas of need for improvement. Now, to the agency's credits, to ISC and FPS's credit, they have constructively addressed many of these recommendations. But to our next update is in 2025, and so we will be looking at how the agencies address the remaining open recommendations, including the recommendations that I've discussed today on facility security assessments. We'll also have an ongoing review looking at FPS's addressing of challenges, physical security challenges at buildings. So we'll be completing that in the fall, and we'll use that to consider where things stand for 2025. So bottom line, we need to see further progress on our open recommendations, and we'll consider that as whether to take this off the high-risk list.
Great, thank you. So we are critical infrastructure like the United States electrical grid is certainly very vulnerable to physical as well as cyber trespass that can disrupt transformers, electric transmission lines. My question for you is, can you explain how CISA is mitigating these threats and what measures it is encouraging federal agencies in particular to adopt to help secure this critical infrastructure in our country?
Yes, sir. Matter of fact, a very timely question now that we're coming to the end of Critical Infrastructure Protection and Resilience Month. We work with all sectors to ensure that they can mitigate the threats they face. Just recently, we published a toolkit in collaboration with HHS for public health. With respect to substation security, we've been working with Department of Energy for well over 10 years. All across the nation, we have protective security advisors who will support the local electricity providers to do security assessments at their substations. We're all familiar with what occurred at Metcalf back in 2013, and we totally support the critical infrastructure protection regulation that NERC then followed that event. And as we've seen recently, they've with respect to the threats, Metcalf was focused on the generation of electricity. We're now seeing at distribution sites, and we're seeing a increase with respect to ballistic type attacks. So we're working with electricity providers with their risk management process to see how best to mitigate the threats at those substations. There's many options, and every substation is very unique. So and we'll continue to support them. As mentioned, the public health, we're supporting water, wastewater with respect to their cybersecurity requirements. And as you recall, back in March, we released the cybersecurity performance goals, which are focused on that information technology and operational technology, which with respect to the cyber threat speaks to many of the lifeline subsector cyber risk that they face.
Great, thank you. Director Klein, back to some personnel issues. We've talked about the vacancies and training, but I know in order to supplement folks, you have hired a number of contract guards to help protect the facilities. So I want to question is, when you hire these contract folks, how do you conduct oversight to ensure that they've received the necessary training to protect these federal facilities that require usually additional training than you may get from a contract guard?
Right. So the Protective Security Officer Program has been around I joined FPS 21 years ago, and it was in place before I joined. So these are the people that you see at our federal facilities. They are conducting screening operations, X-ray magnetometer. They're conducting roving patrol security operations around the federal facilities. They're staffing facility command centers to review video surveillance system monitors. And they are basically the first line of defense at those federal buildings that you're going to enter, those highest risk federal facilities. They have the PSOs at the entrances doing that screening operation. They also ensure that the federal employees that are coming in, that they have the required access media or ID cards to get into the facility. We spend a lot of time during compliance assessments and inspections of the PSOs every year. We do this through post-inspections where our inspectors will visit their assigned facilities and do inspections of the protective security officers that are assigned to that building. We also have a database where all of their training records are maintained, and we can see that on a daily basis. It also alerts us if any of those training requirements come out of date. We don't allow that protective security officer to stand post until their training requirements are fulfilled. Have 13 different training requirements that they have every year that they have to meet. And then also their suitability background investigations is almost identical to what most federal law enforcement officers are. We spend a lot of time overseeing these contracts. We do a lot of these contracts throughout the country. We're visiting with them every day. So right now at this minute, there's about 6,250 protective security officers on duty across the country and our territories. We know how critical of a role they play in the defense of our protective facilities, and we spend a lot of time ensuring that their training records are maintained properly, that they are meeting all the requirements, and that they are complying with the requirements of the post orders at their specific facility.
Right. Well, thank you, and I want to thank each of our witnesses for being here today. I certainly appreciate your contributions to this discussion, and appreciate all the men and women who work for your respective agencies, keeping us safe each and every day. Protecting our federal facilities and the Americans who use them every day is absolutely fundamental to our national security. And as chairman of this committee, I'll work with my colleagues to find ways to ensure that agencies take up the recommendations of the Federal Protective Service and strengthen our security in those federal buildings. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on December 14th of 2023 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.